I'm sure you guys have a lot in common and a few things that don't quite agree. Is there anything that you guys wanted to start off with, or any topics that spring to mind, or shall I just get it out?
I think you just kick it off that part.
Did you hear any of that?
Did I hear anything? No.
Oh, okay. It's a long preamble.
Not everyone shout.
Right. So just wondering if there are any topics that spring to mind, because there's certainly a lot of commonality between the approaches you guys have, and then there's certain differences as well.
Yeah, well, I should start by saying that I'm a big fan of David's work, and Rework, for those who haven't read it yet, is a great read. So I really enjoyed it. And I think that all of us who are trying to reimagine what entrepreneurship might look like, obviously are grappling with the same issues around, and Dave was talking about, how do you know what features need to be in the product versus not in the product? How do you know who to listen to and not listen to when you take feedback or not? And how do you know that you're making progress when you're building a product? Especially when you're not sure who the customer is going to be, or you're not sure what the market for it is going to be. And so I don't know, that's usually, I think, a good place to start. I don't know, David, if you have thoughts about, given that you might be completely on the wrong track, how do you know if you're making progress?
Sure, so for us it's been always really simple in that we only build software for us. So we're on the right track if we like what we build. If we like what we build. And we're on the right track if we're sort of eager. We would have been eager to get our credit card out to pay somebody else for the same solution. So for us, it's definitely as much about the second part as it is about the first. You can build something useful that people want to use and have fun with, but if they don't want to get their credit card out, then I don't really care. Like, they might be having fun and that's all good, but if I'm doing this as a professional venture, as a company, none of it matters unless they get out of the credit card, which is why I'm often so annoyed, not downright offended, by the number of startups that launch that doesn't have a price tag. Like, we'll listen to customer feedback and we'll see what they say, and then we'll try to figure out how to make that pay. What? No. That won't work. I'll tell you what they'll tell you. They'll tell you, hey, you used to give me this shit for free. Why do I have to pay now? And that's not going to be a welcome discussion. And there's so much prior art on this. Like, there's just so many companies who launched without a paid product because they could, because somebody else was paying for the party. And then they come out there, and then all of a sudden they have to charge money for it, and the population gets restless.
So do you think there is any way to build a business that is not based in a revenue model from day one?
Yes, a lottery business. If you think that you're going to be the next Facebook or Twitter, or in general just want to play the startup buyout lottery game and see if Uncle Google wants to pick you up, then go for it. I don't think there's any way to build a real sustainable business from day one to do it, or I shouldn't say that. There's not good odds that you will end up with a good sustainable business if you do not charge from day one. There are odds, just like you can win the Powerball jackpot and $100 million in lottery just by buying a coupon. So there are odds, and some people try to chase them, but I think way too many people do. I think it's a huge distraction from all the awesome companies that could have been built by all these clever people. We were just talking about financial industry here in London, and I think that's another example of just sucking out great brain power and applying it to bad things. I think the startup scene that doesn't focus on building businesses are sucking out valuable brain power that we could have used to build the next group of businesses that's going to fund the economy. I think that's a damn shame.
Yeah, well, no, I have no disagreement there, that's for sure.
Let's get something that we do disagree on. It's more fun.
Yeah, well, so I disagree with what you're saying now, and I guess I feel obligated, since I'm sitting in Silicon Valley, as we speak, to defend a little bit of the venture-backed ecosystem here. But it's not, which is not to say that your critique is wrong. I mean, I think we have plenty of entrepreneurs here who are basically wasting people's time. That is, they've devoted years of their lives, and like I said, to a very much of a lottery ticket mentality. They wind up building a product and rounding up a talented group of people, and then they're fundamentally building something that has either no business value, or, I mean, God forbid, sometimes not even any value to customers. So it's kind of it's a double loss. But I think that you're overgeneralizing in saying that anyone who builds a product that doesn't have a revenue model from day one, I should be clear, that isn't charging customers money for their product from day one, is fundamentally engaged in a lottery business. Since there are businesses, and I'm thinking about a lot of businesses in games, a lot of businesses in media, and businesses that actually do have network effects, like Facebook and Twitter, where it is possible, I think, to engineer the prerequisites of a sustainable business model at microscale without having to have a credit card be involved at the beginning. It's just dangerous because, as you said, it's very easy to kid yourself into thinking that you're making progress when nobody's paying you. Because after all, now the business plan, God forbid, says no one's going to pay us money in the early days. So now you're being successful when you have $0 in revenue. That is admittedly a real trap that people fall into. But I think with some discipline, it can be avoided.
I just don't think that this discipline is there. And I also think that that's exactly how you come up with these bullshit metrics where if you can't attach a dollar value to it, people start talking about, oh, we have so many users, we have so and so many page views, we have all these other metrics that can't be converted into anything. And the only reason we're using them is because we can't use the one real metric that matters when you're a business, which is profit. If you can't turn that into profit, it's all for nothing. And I think the kidding is even going on at the highest levels. So if you look at places like Twitter, I constantly see this commentary on it. Well, they're this huge thing. All they have to do now is turn on the revenue faucet. And they're not turning it on. Exactly why? Because they're being generous? What's going on? No, they're not. They're not trying to turn it on in most instances for these companies. Let's not even talk specifically about Twitter. Because if you turn it on and all that comes out is strips, you're not worth $1 billion anymore. You're worth 15 times your last year profits, like any other business would be. And that number is going to be so laughably small that no VC would invest in you. So I think that that's where the lottery mentality comes in, that this whole game only works if, A, you think you're going to be Google, and you're not. There's one Google per decade that's going to turn out these billion-dollar quarters of this thing. Or you're going to get picked up by somebody who have enough money not to care that their acquisition is going to be a waste.
The audio's cut out again here. I got everything up to only one Google per decade.
Well, and then, or that hello? 1, 2, 3?
I'm sorry, folks, we're experiencing technical difficulties. This is actually a really great way to win an argument, though, because I can't hear anything David's saying.
I'll make a mime.
Yeah, that'll be good. Sign language, at least. That came through.
Okay, it's you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're being too pessimistic about the possibility to create businesses of multi-billion-dollar value more than once a decade. I mean, I think Google, of course, is an aberration and a real outlier. But I think that it is possible that there is a different style of entrepreneurship than the style that you preach, not better or worse, simply different, that does require risk capital in the early days and is aspiring to build an organization of significant size over the course of time. And those, I mean, there's obviously going to be a higher failure rate of those kinds of organizations than the kind of web-based small business that can be profitable from the very early days. But they also have some advantages, namely that you can build a product for somebody else, not the kind of product you would want to buy, because many of us are not in the exact right demographic group to support a very large business. And the level of economic value and kind of worldwide impact that you can have is greater. I do think we have to significantly reform the ways in which we build those companies. I mean, that is what the lean startup is all about. When you're talking about the bullshit metrics that people use to justify their existence, we call it in the lean startup vanity metrics. The metrics that help you look good but don't help you make any decisions. That's like whenever you hear someone be like, the total GDP of all the transactions in our system is X. And you're like, why don't you just tell me how much money you made? Rather than like the GDP of your supposed virtual nation state. It's like, please. You're doing that because that's the biggest possible number that you can quote. And and then we also have this thing, we see a lot of success theater here in Silicon Valley, right? The work you have to do to make it seem like you're being a success when you don't actually have any real success to show. So, I mean, believe me, I join you in those critiques. And yet I also think that we can improve our odds of being successful even in businesses that are attempting to achieve, venture-backed scale returns by, like I said before, trying to prove the business in microscale, which I see as a generalization of what you guys are talking about. Where, yes, one way to prove the business in microscale is to show that it's profitable, on a cash basis from its early customers. But I think there are other ways to validate that you have a real business model that will scale, but again, still in microscale. The irony, of course, is that I'm trying to justify building businesses that way, although I personally, businesses that I've built always charge from day one. So, I'm a big believer in, even in a media business, even an entertainment business, using like a freemium business model so that you can understand what the per customer economics are, even if you're not the customer, even if you're going for venture-backed returns, even if, you have that scale of ambition.
All right, three things. One, I think that it's a misnomer in general to think as businesses that set out to charge money as small businesses. If you look at any of the dominating big, even tech businesses that are around, they all started out charging. Oracle, Apple, Microsoft, Dell, they were all companies that charged money for their early products. So I think they turned out to be the billion-dollar hits of sort of sustainable businesses too. If you look at the other end, which is sort of the VC-backed, this was a supposed success, you could look at stuff like MySpace. That was a success for what, 2 years? There's a lot of these things that are inherently unproven, except for the exit that an acquirer was willing to pay. They are unproven as entities that can generate sustainable profits that justify their billion-dollar valuations over the long term. And I think even the so-called successes, such as Facebook, like how long have they been around? What, 6 years? They're only now at the point where they're, roughly break even or slight profit? How much money do they have to make to A, earn back their initial investment, B, earn back all the money they spent going from year 1 to year 6, very significant amounts? It's completely unproven. So even the things that are currently being held up as though these are the winners, the Facebooks and the Twitters, I think are currently unproven and potentially terrible businesses in the same way that so-called successes in the past, like Hotmail or MySpace or whatever these things were, that didn't make it. They were terrible businesses. And I think the second part of this is, this seems to be, like, that's the cream of the crop of what Silicon Valley, VC-backed software stuff is coming out with. Like, if that's the best that comes out with it, I think that's, that should be a death sentence. Like, there's a systemic error in the economics of the ecosystem, tear it down and try again. And thirdly, all this money and all this VC activity, and as we were just talking about, all this brain power that pours into it, could that not be used better elsewhere? Like, the main offense I have to VC dollars being poured into software businesses, they're not capital intensive. You're not building restaurants, machines, or factories anywhere. You are paying a few programmers to sit up long hours and eat pizza under the desk and stuff like that. Like, that's not worthy of millions of dollars of VC capital that could be going elsewhere.
Yeah, well, I will say that you're right that, but it's good that we're being really clear in our definitions. I think too much conversation about entrepreneurship is sloppy, and we just kind of, it's very myth-oriented. So I appreciate you being really specific. So the question about whether to charge money early or not is a completely orthogonal question to whether to raise VC money or not. Because as you point out, there are VC-backed companies that did and did not charge money, and there are VC-backed companies that have been successful and plenty that have been failed in both categories. I do think it's interesting that you talk about the successful tech companies, even the ones that you mentioned. I think almost all of those were VC-backed.
But why? So, because they had capital expenditures. Apple.
Well, they had capital, for good reason. I'm not trying to say that everybody should be venture-backed, but I do think there are companies that require venture backing in order to achieve the kind of scale we're talking about, and who will be in competitive situations where that ability to scale will allow them to defeat competitors who don't have the same ability. I mean, I think Oracle's a pretty good case there. But even in the cases, I mean, and I think I want to disagree with you factually on the question of whether these kind of businesses that have these crazy valuations are in fact economically viable, or whether it's kind of just paper profits. I mean, Facebook, I think, is actually a good example. I'm a big Facebook skeptic, and always have been. I always felt like, boy, these guys raised a lot of money, but they'll do at least $500 million in revenue this year, and significantly more next year.
Who cares about revenue?
I think
profits.
What's that?
Who cares about revenue?
That's right.
The only thing that matters is profits, and they are certainly not making $500 million in profits.
That's true, but their hard costs are quite low relative to the revenue that they're making. So they're choosing to reinvest that capital, which again, they could be making the wrong decision. I'm not trying to say everybody or even they are doing the right thing, but I think it's hard to argue that they're not generating a lot of economic value. I think the evidence at this point is, I mean, even YouTube is actually making money for Google now, and so I think, again, these are difficult conversations to have when we only have these outliers to talk about, especially because I think the really valuable thing that what you're saying is, for every successful company that we know of that won the lottery, how many companies do we not know of? Right? How many companies raise venture money and accomplish nothing? That's the bigger thing, and that's why if you look at the system-wide economics of the venture business, they're not doing that well the last 12 years. And when you say, let's rip it down and start over again, I don't agree with that exact formulation, but I do think what we're trying to do with the lean startup is provide an alternate model to this traditional model. But what we want to do is try to figure out, how can we use venture capital well, right? Because especially software, but I think everything's increasingly going to look like a software business, as software infects industry after industry. The really cool thing is, again, in a case of a business like Facebook, and I don't need to keep picking on them, we just happen to be talking about them, that's a great example of a software business that did require significant capital in order to scale, because it is extremely, the operations costs of operating Facebook were quite high. But the venture money was not raised until the product market fit was clear. So, I think Facebook is actually a good example of proving your business model in micro scale, and then scaling it up with venture money, when the time is appropriate.
I think the problem then just is, if Facebook is our winner, if Facebook is sort of on the pedestal of like, they won the game of taking VC money and then they build it out slow and blah, 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 blah. They should be a freaking better winner. Like, they're a terrible winner even still. And this is how long into this process of trying the model? Like, they're not even a very good winner. Like, they have a fair amount of revenues, but they spent most of it, so there's no profits yet, and there's certainly no repayment on investment. How long do we have to push out the timeline until we can, with no question, saying Facebook was worth all the money?
On their 10th anniversary, we should have that conversation.
Right, isn't that pathetic? If the best of the industry has to spend 10 years to get to the point where initial repayment initial investment gets repaid, that's terrible. Like, that's the best. Like, what's the worst guy going to spend? 100 years?
No, listen, I think my hope is that what we'll do is help companies that are not going to become next Facebook fail a lot sooner and not waste a lot of time. Because I think the less successful companies ought to be over sooner.
Or they should be playing a different game.
What's that?
Or they should be playing a different game. Like, why play to lose? Like, you're saying, well, they should be over sooner. I think they should just be using their brain power and resources to play a different game. Don't play the VC back 1 in a million shot of getting a mediocre success.
Well, I think we can change the odds of that success. And so I agree with you that the current system is broken. I'm in no position to defend it. I don't think anybody is. The question is, what can we do as an industry to change the odds of success of entrepreneurs? I think forsaking risk capital entirely, we're going to miss a lot of opportunities to create a lot of value. Although that's not, by no means is that the worst outcome I can imagine. The status quo is pretty bad, so I think anyone who's looking to change it is to be commended. But I think we have a disagreement about whether these kind of very ambitious businesses are worth seeking a model to build. We were having this conversation 3 or 4 years into Amazon, right? That was in the height of the dot-com bubble. Think about how much money Amazon had to spend. It seemed like they were setting money on fire to build that early advantage. And I was right there with you to be like, I can't believe they're wasting all this money. But it turns out that it did work. Now, did it work in the most efficient way possible? right? I think even in these success stories, we can ask a question, which is, did we get the maximum value possible out of all the time and energy we invested, or could they have gotten to their destination cheaper, faster, and at ultimately lower risk, not just for themselves, but to overall GDP, which is you're saying, I think, really calling attention to in the right way, where we are squandering a lot of very precious resources by throwing people into companies that don't matter. So I think when we change our mentality from just like linear execution of a plan, which I think we both, we would certainly agree is a terrible idea. I think you're doubly right that if you're going to do linear execution of a plan and then you strap a rocket engine to it, then in the form of raising VC money too early, then you're doubly screwed or 10x screwed. But I think so I think we can agree about that. And then I think there's still a conversation to be had, which is, but what if we shifted our mindset, our mentality from this kind of linear execution to a more iterative, more learning and discovery model? Would that create other more interesting business models other than just the 37 signals approach? I think the answer is yes.
I'm glad you guys are on opposite sides of the world.
You're on mute again, as far as I can tell. So.
Sorry.
Very handy.
We've got a lot of entrepreneurs in the room who are, I think this conversation is quite useful and quite enlightening. But a lot of people I've spoken to, can you hear me all right?
No, I can't hear you at all.
Oh no.
Yeah, much better. Okay, well.
All right. So the people in the room, there's you can't see, but you're facing about 150, and they're all waving at you. There we go.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
When we're talking about viability and ways of approaching viability, I think waste is certainly a key issue for both of you guys. But a lot of the companies that we're facing right now are at this point where it's pre VC time, right? It's pre viability, it's pre product market fit, and there are still differences. Certainly, we sort of touched on scratching your own itch versus scratching your customer's itch, and I think there's a whole argument to be had there. But ultimately, the common goal is to approach viability using Agile, essentially. Now there's different talk about how to do that, how to say no, what to choose, how to arrive at a minimum viable product. So does anyone want to take it at that level as a sort of pre-VC guys in the room here who have that problem right now, who are basically pre-traction?
I can't see if David's trying to answer, because now I can see it's the crowd. Hi, everybody.
Sorry, what was that?
I can't see if David's about to answer. I don't want to talk.
Oh, David, do you want to take it, or Eric?
Well, I'll give my short take. I think even using these terms is kind of hard or harmful. Something as pre-viability, like what is that exactly? I think that you should treat that as a separate stage, so to speak. Like treating yourself as like I'm a pre-business. Like I don't think so. I think even the term startup is harmful. I think there are just businesses, and then there are businesses that are not yet profitable, and there are businesses that are profitable. And if you are in the former category, you should get in the latter category as soon as possible. But then, because I think it informs your decision making. I think if your key goal is to get profitable as soon as possible, you will create a simpler, leaner product because you're in a hurry and you want to get there. And the thing that most people will buy from new ventures is not a very complex, honking, everything bells and whistles product. They will buy something simple that they can understand will solve their problem. So you're sort of double winning here. Like I often get not to harp too much on the VC thing, but in Europe, a lot of the criticism of sort of startup culture or startup environment is there's no money available. Well, thank your lucky stars there's no money available, because that means that you won't be distracted trying to chase it. You will now have the divided attention of trying to get a business off the ground while you have to do something else to support yourself. And I think that sort of split attention is the best thing that you can do for your product. That's certainly how we got started, as split attention. We couldn't focus dedicatedly 100% of our time on it. We certainly didn't have a big team. We don't have those things, you tend to build simple stuff, because that's the only thing you can build. And when you build simple stuff, I think you have a much easier time finding customers. And when you have an easier time finding customers, you get to profitability faster and so on and so forth.
Yeah, you know, the issue with this having a dialogue, that's of course we agree way more than we disagree, but it's boring if we just sit here and say you're right. So, in the interest of disagreeing, let me isolate one part of what you're saying and then and try to build on it. This question about whether a startup is different than a business, I think is actually important, because I actually think there is such a thing as a startup, and it is different than a business. A startup is not just an unprofitable business, because there are plenty of businesses that go from profitability to unprofitability, and they don't become a startup at that time. They're just having an execution problem. And I think as entrepreneurs, we too often think of our mistakes or problems in a startup phase as execution problems rather than learning and discovery problems. And so I think it's very useful to identify being a startup as a separate phase of a company's life, not because that should then excuse us to be sloppy in our execution, but because we can then ask ourselves, well, what is the purpose of this phase? What is it that we're trying to do? And you're right, one of the things we're trying to do is discover our business model. But I think that's you know, I think it's glossing over a very important and challenging phase of a startup's life to just say, well, just get something out there and charge for it and then you're set. Because actually, a lot of businesses are more complicated than that. Even a simple product has to be distributed to a specific set of customers at a specific price point, and has to have the right set of features, the right things included, and more importantly, to your point, the right things removed. And so I think it's better to think of a startup as a series of experiments designed to reveal that business model that ultimately will allow us to accomplish whatever our goal is. Whether the goal is to scale a venture-backed company or our goal is to just simply build a profitable small business that is in our control. I mean, I honor both goals. Both of them require a fundamental understanding of who is the customer, what market are we in, and what are the requirements. I hate to use the word requirements, I shouldn't say that. I want to say, what are the facts about how those customers respond to a product like ours? So when we talk about this concept of the minimum viable product, you know, there's a question about, well, minimum with regard to what? Okay, so, and then viable with regard to what? I mean, I think those are really the big questions. My point of view is minimum meaning the least amount of work necessary to begin that learning process, to conduct the first experiment. And viable meaning only that when you put the product in people's hands, you have a strong hypothesis about what's supposed to happen when they see it, which could be as simple as, when people see this, if they have this problem, they'll definitely buy it. That's what I always start there. I'm always like, oh, I'm confident that, you know, when I have 100 people try my product, 50 of them will buy it. And then it's like, oh, right, except that it's more like 0 of them. Oops. And then the delta between 0 and 50, or 0 and whatever the model says it's supposed to be, becomes the opportunity for each iteration to then be targeted at learning a specific thing. Is that making sense?
Sure, I just think it's well, it's making something that's, in my mind, ultimately incredibly simple seem way more complex. Discovering a business model, I think, is a very fancy way of just finding a product that people actually want to buy. Like, that is how, 98% of businesses in the world operate. They have a product or a service that people pay money for directly. It's the last 2% that get into the fancy mechanics of how to get somebody else to pay for it, either through advertising or other sort of indirect means. And I think the default approach should just be, we will build a product that, or service that is so desirable that people will pay for it. I don't see why you have to reinvent anything here. What is the hypothesis we need to prove? It is proven. If people like shit, they pay for it. So I don't think that there is a lot of sort of exploration needed, other than, all right, let's arrive at a product that people want to pay for. So it's sort of that's why I sometimes have a problem with the whole notion of the business model, as though it was this complex thing or a thing of study. I think for most companies, there is no study. There is just, you produce desirable goods, and then you reap market rewards. Like, it's no more complex than that. And when we dress it up into sort of more complex terms, I think we sort of muddle the waters and we get away from for most people, it's just, if people aren't buying your stuff, it's because your stuff sucks. And I mean, sure, there's some feedback there. I agree. I mean, if 0 people are buying your stuff, it is not good stuff. So that's sort of the first order of it. The second order is make your stuff better, and then try again. If people buy now, or if they did, all right, your stuff got better. So I think it's just incredibly simple, which is why it's sometimes, I think, annoying that we even have to talk about it, because I think it's only in tech circles where this is actually a topic of discussion, that you make good stuff and people pay for it. Like, why is this even a topic of conversation?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you why it's a topic of conversation. It's because for those of us who don't necessarily know what the product should be, it's complicated to figure out what makes the product better or worse. I mean, I understand, since you guys are building products for yourselves, you have the customer kind of knowledge really ingrained. So maybe you're right that everybody should build products for themselves, and then that will be the end of it. But to me, that's very limiting as a model, because it says that my economic opportunities are limited by my experience with products that I know about. Whereas I think many people have had a lot of success building products for somebody else. Now, the problem is, as soon as you break the connection between yourself and your product, and every time you add any layer of complexity to the business model, you take on additional risk. The risk that you could get sloppy and forget that, let's see how to say this. That it's easy to convince yourself that you're making progress. I think that is really the challenge. But I don't think that saying we just want to take the simplest path possible is right. I mean, I understand the appeal of it, and I understand kind of emotionally why that resonates. And yet I think we owe it to ourselves to ask, is it possible to do more than just that? Because I don't think it's true that 98% of businesses are extremely simple. I think actually most businesses have some complexity to them, a complexity about who is the customer, right? How do I know that these customers will want it? If nobody's buying my product, is it because the product is badly designed, or is it because I'm not communicating the value of the product to the right people? And so I think there's just a bunch of questions like that that have to be answered in the startup's early days, unless you really want to have a very limited sense of the kinds of businesses that you can start.
Well, I think that the problem with it, labeling businesses that are designed for that the builder is the same as the user, and as a limited scope, I think is wrong. Like, if you look at any of the big tech companies, when you look at Microsoft, do you think Bill Gates was designing Windows for himself? I think he was. I think that he was designing any of the other early products for himself? I think in large part he was. If you look
at he designed MS-DOS for IBM for himself?
I think absolutely. As a programmer, he was designing it for his own sensibilities. He wasn't going out there trying to focus group other programmers or other developers to get to that point. I think the same thing is true even today if you look at something like Apple. Like, Steve Jobs is full on designing the iPad for himself. Like, I think there's a lot of this stuff where, sure, you get input from customer groups, but the key designer in these cases are still a person who believes that this product is for me.
Well, I think we're conflating two things, so let's be a little bit careful. I'm not advocating focus groups, and I'm certainly not advocating that people abdicate their design responsibilities. But I think even the great designers, even Steve Jobs, I don't think it's right that he's designing for himself. I mean, we don't know because his design process is secret. So, what level of customer feedback is involved in the Apple design process? I mean, I don't think anyone has a very good idea. They certainly like the...
We take it, he at least believes that he's designing for himself. I've read numerous interviews saying that, well, he designed the iPod.
Well, I understand that he says that in public, but I mean, I think we've got to go on a little bit more than just, what Apple PR puts out about how their design process works.
Well, then that's true for any company. Like, you could say the same thing about our products. Like, I'm not just designing basically for myself. Like, obviously we have other customers. I'm just saying that the great share of the design responsibility, the feedback loop is coming from you, knowing whether it's shipped or not.
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge. I do think that there's a role for strong design and a strong design ownership in building a product where you take in feedback, just as you're saying, and then you decide whether to listen to it or not. You decide how to respond to it. But I think most entrepreneurs have an overinflated sense of their ability to tell the difference between something that's great and something that's crap. Because great and crap are subjective terms and they only matter in the eyes of the customer. Now, that's really challenging. there are a lot of situations where the right thing to do is to launch a crappier product sooner than to launch a more perfect, more beautiful product later. Are we in agreement about that?
Oh, absolutely. I just think that if it's hard for you, if you take yourself in the role of, can I determine whether it's crap or not crap? Like, if you can't make the decision for yourself, like making that at the second order of sort of indirectness, trying to figure out whether some other customer think it's good or not, is going to be just endlessly harder. If he can't even make the decision for himself and be good about it, how is he going to make it on the behalf of somebody else?
Excellent. So that's a question I can answer because I spent the last 5 years of my life building a product for 3D avatar virtual worlds. I won't go into the details, but I was building a product that's primarily used by young teenage girls. And hi, I don't know if you can see on the video, that's not me. And it was very challenging because we thought we were building a product for ourselves and then discovered we were building a product for someone else. The first problem is sometimes you're not building the product for who you think you're building it for. That's very frustrating. We decided consciously to go after the customers who seem to like our product instead of the ones like us who we wanted to like our product. We kept being like, oh, well, life would be so much easier if people like us were buying this product, but of course it wasn't. But what you can do is, I believe, you can train your design sensibility and your judgment to get better over time so that you get better and better at kind of intuitively understanding what your customer wants so that you can replicate that experience of having that intuition about design, but it requires a lot of rigor in like creating hypotheses, being explicit about what you think is supposed to happen with your supposedly great design, and then actually taking it seriously when that thing doesn't happen. So the most common experience that I see with teams that I work with is that something like 60% of the features that they build and work that they do makes no difference to customers whatsoever. Right? I'm sure you see the same thing, right? That you launch a feature that most teams don't.
Yourself, that's true. Even when you design it for yourself, that's true.
Yeah, so I've seen teams actually be able to lower that failure rate by being really rigorous about testing each thing that they do and starting to ask themselves questions like, wait, why do we keep building things that nobody cares about? That's a waste of time. And getting the whole company involved in that question is, as you know, very important. So the question is, how do you build, I think we have these kind of meta questions. How do you build a culture and a process that forces everybody to confront the gaps between their own design intuition and what actually changes customer behavior? So you don't get that phenomenon you see designers all the time, which is, my design is so amazingly awesome and beautiful that it affects customer behavior not one iota. But it's really beautiful anyway.
Absolutely. So if you're designing for teenage girls, the more you can be a teenage girl, the better off you are.
Well, that turns out to be really challenging. It's not as easy an option as maybe you're trying to make it sound. And yet we were able to find ways to have our engineers and actually our whole company understand the needs and wants of customers. Actually, and I use teenage girls only because they are the most difficult demographic for us to understand. It's used by quite a wide range of people, and so it was actually hard for us to keep in mind all of the different archetypes and personas and actually integrate all of that feedback into some kind of coherent design. It was quite hard. So you're right that by taking on that challenge, you're making life harder for yourself. But I think if you look at the majority of businesses, they have some dimension to them that has complexity to it. I think only pursuing the simplest business models, the simplest businesses, I think that's kind of too easy and out. That's just my opinion.
Pretty good. That's a pretty good place to at least pause this conversation. I think.
Oh, that's harsh.
You had the last word. I think it was a good last word too.
Yeah, I like the last word.
Yeah. We do have to whisk David off to the next session. So we've got Eric on to explain lean startup to us.